Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide. All right, you are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. If you have questions, you can send them to me, Kathleen, through the chat as they occur to you. I will keep track of them and collect them so we can ask them all during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical challenges today, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat and he can help you troubleshoot that. And so you know, this event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns there. Thanks again for joining us, and Dr. Haenschen, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Well, nice to see you all virtually. Sorry I can't come up to Maine this election cycle. It was the original plan, but definitely it's an exciting time. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the research behind why you might be getting so many political texts. So show of hands, or go ahead and type in the chat box if you've received any sort of political text message so far this cycle, whether it's a solicitation for funds, a solicitation for voting, check your registration, volunteer, you name it. Yeah, yes, several a day, exactly. I actually got texted during class this week while I was teaching my students about digital outreach. I got a political text during class, so it's a real thing. So I'm going to be talking about why we see so much of this type of texting, specifically in the context of recruiting volunteers and mobilizing people to get out to vote. So just a little bit of background about me. I am an assistant professor in the Departments of Communication Studies and Political Science here at Northeastern University. I study political participation in digital media, and I predominantly do field experiments where we randomly assign people to get some sort of digital intervention and then measure to see whether that actually changed their voting behavior. And that work is informed by the approximately 10 years I spent working on campaigns in Austin, Texas. So a lot of my research is taking what practitioners are doing out in the real world and applying that, studying that in a more kind of rigorous scientific context. So that's where some of today's research comes from. So big picture, why are people texting you so much? First off, access. We're going to talk about why the text message itself has become such a popular form of outreach. Efficiency, we're going to talk about how easy it is to send these text messages. And then effectiveness. I'm going to show you the results of some experiments that show why you do actually want to be sending text messages to voters and to volunteers. So first off, access. Here in the United States, 96% of American adults have a cell phone. Cell phone adoption is near universal. Only about 40% of households even have a landline anymore, right? Across the board, we've seen a lot of decline in landline usage, especially amongst younger generations and amongst communities of color. There's a much lower rate of landline adoption. And 59% of households are cell phone only. So right off the bat, people are texting you so much because more people can be reached by cell phone text messages than they can be reached through traditional landline outreach. So right off the bat, that's why. If cell phones weren't as popular or widespread, if it were easier or feasible to get more people on the phone, we would not have seen such a sort of meteoric rise in political texting that has occurred over the last just 4 to 6 years, really. So people have cell phones. That alone isn't a good reason to just say we should do a whole huge amount of political texting. Text messages are also efficient to send at large scale. So this here on the left, you can see this graphic is one of the popular commercial texting platforms that you can use to send text messages to people, where you can customize the message you send with various data fields and customize your response to them. So there's three ways that we can think about sending these text messages. The first is mass texting with an opt-in. So for instance, if Maine League of Conservation Voters has a list of members who've given their cell phone to the organization and opted in, right, you can just blast that list. You could just use a commercial mass texting service, upload the list of numbers, send the text message out. That's perfectly legal, right? So it's very inexpensive and efficient to text members of member organizations who've already provided their cell phone number and consented. Now, if you're just reaching out to the public, to voters at large, you can't necessarily mass text. There's some laws against that. So a person has to be clicking a button to send each text. And that's where these platforms like you're seeing here come into play. They make it so that an individual can send hundreds, if not 1,000 individual text messages during a volunteer session just by clicking a button over and over. And there's a number of commercial platforms that provide this service, some that you use your cell phone for, others that you use a computer or a tablet. But these platforms exist that make it really easy to send tons and tons and tons, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of text messages. And the last is the good old copy and paste. One experiment I'm going to show you that I conducted with an organization called Sister District. We did the texting just by having people copy and paste the message and send it to each individual person in the study, right? So even that's an easy, relatively efficient way to go. All of these things are faster than making live phone calls. They're faster than calling people and leaving voicemails when they don't pick up. So it's a faster way of conducting outreach. You can attempt to talk to more people much more quickly than you can with live phone calls or knocking on doors. So they're efficient. They're quick, easy to send, and faster than other forms of phone-based outreach in particular. So everybody has a cell phone. Text messages are quick and easy to send at large scale. That alone could explain some of why we see people doing this. But the real benefit and why you're seeing these text messages take off over the last few elections is their effectiveness. Text messages are incredibly effective at increasing voter turnout and increasing volunteer signups and attendance. So these are the experiments that I'm going to show you today. So when it comes to voting, I worked on a set of experiments with an organization called Vote.org, which is a nonpartisan voter mobilization group. And we wanted to find out what the effect was of receiving a text message versus not receiving a text message on voter turnout in the 2018 midterm. And we found that if you were assigned to receive the text, you were 0.27 percentage points more likely to vote than the control group, the group that didn't receive any text messages from this organization. So just our texts, most people got about 3 text messages over the course of the election. That was enough to increase turnout by 0.25%. Now you may think, oh, 0.25%, that's nothing. Well, a change in 0.25% in turnout is amongst targeted voter populations can absolutely make the difference in a close state or in a close election. So that margin, when directed at strategically at certain voters, can absolutely make the difference. We found that the message content wasn't particularly important. We tried all sorts of different messages, telling people to remind a friend as well, telling people to put it on their calendar, just a standard practice of where to go and what to do. And generally speaking, the message content didn't really matter. So it seems to be something about getting the text message itself, getting those noticeable reminders on your cell phones. That seems to be a big part of why this tactic works. And one other thing before I go on, I do want to put into context that 0.25 percentage point or so increase, that's not too far off from what we see from a lot of direct mail efforts to increase voter turnout and some less skilled live calling efforts. So nobody really questions the value of phone banking. No one seems to really question the logic of sending a lot of mail reminding people to vote. So we see that these types of mass texting using these types of computerized platforms that we did in the study are about as effective as phone banking and as sending direct mail. So the other thing that we found that was really important is that you want to promote both early voting and election day voting. Just promoting early voting didn't actually increase turnout amongst our subjects. They were no more likely to vote than people who were in our control group who we didn't text. The people who we texted about election day only, or who we texted about early and election day, were statistically significantly more likely to vote. So we want to focus these treatments throughout the voting period, let people know early voting starting Monday, or whatever the schedule is, throughout that early voting period. Then make sure to text them again right before election day to make sure they're ready to get out there and vote on election day. And this is where the fact that text messages are really cheap and easy to send at these large scales, this matters, because you may not want to send somebody 3 pieces of political mail in 2 weeks before an election, or you may not be able to afford to, but you can afford to send multiple text messages. So that's what we found: promote early voting and promote election day voting. Don't just promote early voting. We also found that even one text can boost turnout. So most of the people in our experiment got 3 to 5 text messages over the early voting to election day window. But we found that even just one text message delivered right before election day can have a positive impact on turnout. So even if an organization can only afford to do a little bit of texting, that last blast right before the election day itself can have a positive impact. Now, when it comes to volunteering, this experiment I conducted with a group called Sister District, and we wanted to figure out how to more effectively recruit volunteers. And Sister District is a group with regional and geographic-based chapters that encourages members to come together to do things like phone banks or postcard parties to support the candidates that they endorse. And so what we wanted to find out was if the effort of calling the volunteers and either leaving a voicemail, calling them and texting them, or just texting them, was more effective than only sending them an email about an upcoming volunteer opportunity. So what we found was that when you do these added efforts, when you do this calling and texting and whatnot, you do get more people to show up and sign up to your events. But the text message-based outreach was the most effective. We can only say with statistical certainty that sending text messages had the biggest impact. And what we found was that when you text volunteers, they have a higher rate, first off, of saying that they will come, right? Actually committing to the event, responding and saying, yes, I will be there. We also found that when we were confirming our volunteers before their shift, right, reaching out to say, hey, don't forget you're signed up to come to this phone bank on Thursday, can you still make it? Text messaging generated the highest increase in confirmations of people affirmatively responding, yes, I will be there. And that's really important for an organization, because you need to know if half of the people you're expecting to come phone bank are going to flake out on you, right? You want to know ahead of time that the people you've recruited who said they're going to come, you want to confirm them and remind them that they're really supposed to come. And last but not least, texting increased actual attendance. Now, our sample size was pretty small for these studies. We only had about 1,200 would-be volunteers in them. But what we can say is that compared to just getting that email reminding you, encouraging you to sign up online, reminding you to come, that added step of sending a text message is going to increase the number of people that sign up, the number of people that confirm they will show up, and most importantly, the number of people who actually show up. So text messages, because they're cheap and fast, you can do that really quickly, and it doesn't take a lot of organizer time as it does to potentially call through everybody, ask if they can come, remind them to come. So text messages also are an effective way of increasing volunteerism. So access, 96% of American adults have cell phones. More households are cell phone only than landline only. So texting, on the one hand, is popular because people have cell phones. They can receive text messages. Efficiency, these mass texts are faster than calling or knocking. Whether you send a mass text to an opt-in group like a membership organization can do, or you have people pushing a button thousands of times, it is simply faster to send lots of text messages to lots of people than other forms of outreach. And effectiveness. We find that the text messages are scientifically proven to both increase turnout, increase the likelihood of or probability that a person shows up to vote, and increase volunteer activity. So that's the gist. That's why you're getting so many text messages, because they work. So I'm happy to take some questions with the remaining time. If you want to, so Kathleen, if you want to moderate Q&A.
Definitely, that sounds great. And thank you so much. It is so fascinating to get that sort of inside perspective on the access and the efficiency and the effectiveness of texting. Before we get to the questions, I do want to just let our Lunch and Learn regulars know that this is the part of the program where we share a call to action, and it feels pretty obvious that today's pitch is to start texting. Maine Conservation Alliance has been working with a number of partners to make sure that Maine people can vote safely this election season. And so that means really encouraging folks who can vote absentee to do so. And that makes sure that in-person voting is safe and efficient for everybody who needs that. So thank you for that slide. We go ahead and email. Now, I suppose I should have put her text in there. Abigail@maineconservation.org if you'd like to get involved. And as a first step, you see we've got a poll out right now to help each other make a plan to vote in November. How is it going? Have you requested your absentee ballot? 100% of you have so far. Fabulous. And thank you for participating. Wonderful. All right. Now let's ask some questions. So I've got a couple here, and you can feel free to keep them coming as we work through these. So first question, in the study that demonstrated the effectiveness of texting about the early voting and election day voting, did you send two different texts, or was it one text with two messages?
That's a good question. So what we did was we had a kind of calendar of texts. So if you were in the early voting condition, you got 3 texts throughout the early voting period. If you were in the election day period, you got a very similar set of 3 texts that just said election day rather than early voting, but otherwise the language was the same. And then if you were in the early plus election day, you got an extra 2 texts. So they would have kind of gotten what the early voting people got, then got another 2 texts, which were what the election day people were getting. So we tried to keep the kind of message content as consistent across the board. And, we're still talking about at most, 5, and this was run in multiple states, dozens of states. So we're still talking about 5 text messages over the span of 2 to 3 weeks. So reasonably spread out.
And is there any data about how much text messaging is too much? Can you hit that point? And I'll share a story from one of our participants today. She said, one school board candidate texted me up to 3 times a day before the primary, and I voted against that candidate because of that.
Yeah, so one of the challenges is you think about what's going on in the United States right now. You have major national nonprofit organizations texting on a national level. Then you have national campaigns texting on a national level. Then you have federal and statewide campaigns texting within a state. Then if you live in a competitive congressional district, here comes some more texts. And then if you have anything else on your ballot, school board, mayor, whatnot, you're going to get more text. So yes, there's certainly a problem there. And part of it is that these groups can't all coordinate with each other, right? So a national organization can't necessarily say, well, we're going to text everybody last name A through M, you text the N through Z's, right? The campaigns and the nonprofit organizations can't do that kind of strategy. And while in theory, the campaigns and the federal campaigns and the state campaigns can sometimes communicate with each other. Some campaigns just are going to want to go ahead and do what they're doing and talk to their voters and do their thing. So there is this problem of people getting lots of text messages. The second issue is that though 96% of Americans do have a cell phone, we don't have the cell phone numbers on everybody. And in the experiment that I ran with our 12 million people, some people, the cell phone quality, we have this sort of score of how good is the cell phone. Are we sure it's this person, or how sure are we, right? So there's only so many cell phones where we're reasonably sure we're texting the person we want to text, right? And then beyond that, there are, you want to text the people who are politically advantageous to what you're trying to do. So it just starts to be this problem of many, many entities, campaigns, and organizations wanting to text the same pool of people, but only so many of them have cell phone numbers, and only so many of those are deemed to be worthwhile for texting outreach. So you end up with some people getting tons and tons of texts and other people getting no texts at all. I asked my students about this week, and they're 20, 21, 22 years old, and some of them are getting text every single day. Some are getting multiple texts every single day. Others are not getting any texts at all. So there's a huge variation in how this is applied. There's some evidence that in canvassing, if you knock on a door a third time, you might start to have some diminishing returns. So the argument then with canvassing or with phone banking, traditional calling, would be to broaden your list and find more people you want to talk to, rather than talking to the same people again and again and again. The challenge with texting is it's so fast that I was thinking about this the other night. A federal the Biden campaign has about 30,000 people signed up to text. Let's say half of those people actually ever text, right? So that's 15,000 people. Let's say they each do 1,000 texts in a shift. That's 15 million texts, right? Someone check my math in the chat if I'm wrong, but I believe that's 15 million texts. You're starting to approach the limit on the number of people who can be texted. And that's if everybody just does one shift. So there's a crunch there. I think the question is whether there's a diminishing return on it, or it's just eventually the effect of that next text, that 10th text, that 11th text just becomes nothing, right? Like at some point, it doesn't make people less likely to vote. It just makes them, you can't get anyone any more likely to vote. I mean, some of you, I'm sure, are 100% likely to vote. Some of you may have already voted and you're still getting reminders to vote, right? You can remind me to vote 20 times. I'm still going to vote. That 21st reminder isn't like increasing my 100% likelihood of voting. So, but it's a good question, and it's tough to answer those types of questions because we'd really need everyone who's texting to give us the list of all the people they're texting and try and figure it out that way. But, I think the biggest challenge is just that there's more texting capacity. There's more people who want to mash the button than there are people to text. Now, all of that said, I do think that you in Maine should, volunteer with MCV and do this type of texting, because each organization needs to make sure that their work is getting done and their list is getting texted and they get the responses back to see how they're doing. So even though there's some element of like, so many texts, it is important to actually go through and do all the work.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, we can't legally coordinate with the campaigns. Mm-hmm. But is there advice for how we can focus our texting efforts as organizations so that we aren't adding to the noise, but we're adding value?
Sure. One thing we found in our huge 12 million person study, and the benefit to having 12 million people in your study is you can really kind of look for small nuggets of wisdom. If you have a cell phone confidence score if you buy your numbers from a vendor and you have some sort of cell phone confidence score, don't waste your time with bad cell phone numbers. If they have a bad confidence score, it's not them. You're texting a fax machine or whatever, you don't waste your time on those. The other thing we found is that in 2018, So voters are usually given what's called a voter turnout score or propensity score, and it's how likely a person is to vote in a specific election. And it's based on a lot of things, prior voting history, demographics, that sort of thing, how active your sort of neighborhood or area is, what else you have on your ballot, that sort of thing. Usually campaigns ignore the people with the really low scores. And we found that our text messages were still effective on people with propensity scores down to 10. So people that were only 10% likely to vote, we got them up to being 20% likely to vote as an aggregate. Some of that was just that in 2018, it was a very high salience election. There was a lot of interest in it, so people came out and voted. I expect we'll see something similar this year, but that means that the more high salience an election is, the more attention there is, the lower of the turnout scores you can go. And, you know, so I would say that if organizations are worried they don't have enough people to text your like must do people, then do your second tier, do your third tier. You can go all the way down to 0. You're still getting people who will benefit from hearing from you. And the other thing that's true about this election that isn't true about others is that people have so many questions about what to do or where to go. I was talking to my mom last night. She's very nervous about where to mail back her ballot. She has a lot of thoughts about which post office she wants to go to. And so there's a lot of confusion and just nervousness. So it's still worthwhile to be having those conversations with all of your voters to make sure everybody's like, I've got it, I've got my ballot, or I know where I'm going. It's still worthwhile in a way that I might not say was if we were in sort of a more normal circumstances.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. So did you track it all? Are those texts opening, or how often are those texts opening a conversation versus it, you know, popping up and me saying, oh yeah, I got to do that? When do people text back?
My understanding is that across the board, about 90 to 95% of text messages are opened or are seen by the recipients. And not all the platforms can track that, but from what we can tell, 90 to 95%. And that's extremely high relative to, you know, if you've gone out canvassing.
Way better than a phone bank.
You know, so, and if you think about it, it's pretty low key. You get a text message, you look at it, oh, you know, it's a group reminding me to go vote. It's one reason why I think text messages are more effective at recruiting volunteers than voicemails is that you would have to actually listen to the voicemail, then you have to call the person back, and that can be enough to kind of deter someone if you're busy or you got other things on your mind, versus you get a text and you say, sure, you know, can you come this Saturday? Sure. It's less work on the part of the person you're reaching out to. But actually response rates to these kind of mass get out the vote texts are pretty low. Most people don't respond. So, and we don't know enough yet about the people who do respond versus don't, but it's all over the board. So we just look at it as what's the effect of being sent these types of communications.
And are there tools that organizations can use, or that we should be looking for in these texting programs so that the data goes somewhere, you know, so that it feeds into the van or someplace where we can help filter it back and cut down on the number of texts that people get once they click, yes, I've already voted, you can stop texting me?
Any of the major texting platforms should have the ability to export data and put that back into whatever sort of voter file you're using. So if you're, for instance, using the State Voices van for C3, C4 groups, there should be some way to do that. Now, that speaks to an organization having the capacity and the know-how to get the data back and put it back in the van and tag it correctly and then filter your subsequent searches and have everybody else do it. And to some degree, that's probably one reason why folks are getting a lot more text than maybe they need to, because those extra steps take staff time and staff knowledge that maybe isn't widely available, but it is possible.
Yeah, so that local school board candidate that we heard about probably isn't doing that. Does that
might be sitting there with a Google Doc, just like
right.
hammering away, right? Which is how we did our volunteer recruitment experiment. We had a Google Doc and we had 4 people just sit there and text their way through all the would-be volunteers.
Wow. So does that suggest that that maybe this is a little bit more complicated, or a little bit more prone to irritate folks when it comes from at the local level, as opposed to the, has the national texting movement sucked some of the air out of this strategy?
Given that we found that folks who got 5 texts just from vote.org were, as likely to vote on early voting election day as the folks that just got the 3 for election day, and were more likely to vote than folks who just got early voting texting. And then, of course, all of them were more likely to vote than people we didn't text at all. I'm not too terribly concerned, because I know that the people we were texting in that experiment were also getting bombarded by many other groups. And we looked, were the text more effective in people who had competitive Senate races or competitive congressional races? And we found that the texts were more effective in competitive places, but they worked perfectly well in uncompetitive places too. So, at some point, just like texting works, go text people. I think that one thing that I don't think we think enough about, those of us who do this kind of voter turnout research, is that the experience of getting a text, it's quick, you're back to what you're doing a second later. Someone knocks on your door, you have to get up, you have to go to the door. Sometimes, you gotta like put a sweatshirt on, answer the door, have a conversation. The phone call, it can really interrupt what you're doing. So I wonder if the sort of brevity of experiencing a text message is part of like why we might be able to do a lot more of them. Like if you think about what it must be like to live in, the most swingy of swing states, and you're getting your door knocked on, not this year, hopefully, but you're getting your door knocked on every other day, sometimes multiple times in a day. That's really disruptive. So it's not a surprise that at 3, people start being like, ugh, enough of this, right? What I will say though is that I think with the texting lists, they're usually pulled early on. So when we did our experiment with vote.org, we weren't eliminating people who'd already voted. We were just continuing to fire away. So if you already voted, you're still going to get all your texts, because it's actually more work, way more work on a national level to figure out who's voting and filter those people out. It's way faster to just be like, these are the millions of people we want to text, upload them into the texting platform, and have people start texting them. So whereas with a walk sheet or a call sheet, if you're printing those every single day, it's not hard at all to filter out the people that already voted. So
right. And has there been research yet about the sort of intersection of those different voter outreach methods? So, if there's text plus mail plus doors plus phone bank, like, is there a cumulative effect?
There's some evidence that there is. There's some evidence that there is a cumulative effort of getting multimodal contact. Those experiments can be challenging to run for a number of reasons, but we do have some pretty good evidence that it does work. I think one thing that's particularly unique to this cycle is the high rate of people who are voting by mail, who have never voted by mail before, either because they weren't eligible or simply, liked going to their polling place on election day. And so there's this added element this year of voter information and making sure people know what to do and when to do and feel comfortable and confident about that I'm not worried this year about people getting a little too much voter contact, if that's what it takes, so that they know, where to go, what to do. I'm a political science professor, and I still have to figure out, in the primary here, I had to figure out what to do. There's still this element of, things are different. I'm not just going to stroll over to the elementary school and cast my vote in person. So a little extra contact is not a bad thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. You talked a little bit about the limited scope, or the more limited scope of the lists that we have, right? How many people have cell phones that are good numbers? So who ends up in that list? Are there demographic differences of who we're texting versus who we were maybe calling? And are there any sort of racial differences there in both who we're reaching out to and how they're reacting?
It's an interesting question, and that I'm not sure about. One of the challenges is that when you do this kind of research, if you do it with a partner organization, as both of these experiments were, they have a pool of people they want to reach out to. Sister district, their organization, their volunteers are primarily women, women sort of in maybe their late 30s on up, who were particularly mobilized and motivated by the Trump election. So they have a different pool of volunteers than, say, a group that does youth outreach, and their volunteers are all, 18 to 22 years old, right? So some of and we don't talk about that in research as much as we should, but these different groups may have different likelihoods of responding in different ways. The Get Out the Vote experiment, we had the partner organization wanted to target voters of color aged 18 on up, and white women under age 35, I believe, were the two targets, because these are, traditionally underperforming groups in a midterm election. So I can tell you that text messages increase turnout on communities of color and white women under 35. I have no idea what they do to white men under 35 or white people over 35. Those people were not in the subject pool for the experiment, so we don't know. Maybe they would have a greater effect, maybe they would have a lesser effect. I can say that we didn't find any difference by sex. And I don't believe we found any difference by race. Generally, text messages are effective. They're effective on everybody. We didn't find any sort of demographic-based ways to narrow it down. One thing that people are surprised by is the text messages were as effective on voters over 65 as they were, kind of the 18 to 29-year-olds and kind of the, 30 to 65.
Not just the kids who like texts.
Well, it's because everybody has a cell phone, right? It's the not only everybody has a cell phone, but the people whose cell phone numbers we were able to get to be in the experiment, they must have somehow their data was able to match up their cell phone to the voter file, and we were able to find those people so we could text them. So to some extent, if you're textable, you're receptive to being texted.
And what makes you textable? Because I know I've heard some people say, isn't my cell phone private? Why, how did they get this number?
That's a good question. I'm actually not terribly sure about how that works. But, there's commercial data vendors out there. So, we recently moved, so we've been getting this onslaught of flyers from things related to moving, right? That otherwise businesses that would not be contacting us otherwise. We also had a baby, and now Amazon is like, here's things related to having a baby. Surely you want to buy these things. So that information has somehow filtered out into the commercial marketing databases that these people should be, sent stuff related to moving, right? Like furniture ads. These people must want to buy furniture. They just moved. They must want new cable providers, et cetera. And you must want things for this baby. So the commercial data dragnet's pretty intense. And that's the kind of data that we go to for information about getting cell phone matches. It's also where we go for information on who's not registered. We look for people who are in the commercial database who aren't in the voter file in a particular state. And we try and find like, you get these magazines at this address, but you're not registered to vote. We're going to try and register you to vote at that address. So there's some degree of just getting it from the commercial data. And how it gets there, I'm not really sure.
And then, of course, for people who are hearing from organizations like MCV and MCA, it's often our members clicked at some point. That's that opt-in, right? Like, yep. I'm open to being emailed. I'm open to being called.
Yeah. And those are called warm text messages. This is an interesting distinction that I didn't get into too deeply, but warm text messages, in other words, you've given your phone number to an organization, are more effective. They're effective on the range of about increasing turnout by about 2%. Cold text message, which is, 12 million people getting bombarded from the voter file, where there's no pre-existing connection to the organization, those are not as effective. Now, it's hard to get people to sign up with an organization, and arguably, if you do sign up, you're more interested in politics and voting anyways. So part of that, one lesson is if you are doing voter outreach, if you are a membership organization, that effort you spend building that list, going around getting people's cell phone numbers, getting them to sign a petition and give you their cell phone number, passing out sign-up sheets, working community events, all the stuff that we used to be allowed to do. That work pays dividends in growing your list of people that you can then text and remind to vote. But that sort of text message, I think, is particularly more helpful in elections that are not as high profile as this year's presidential election. So if you had a list of members and you have a special election coming up for the water conservation district, yes, you absolutely want to be texting every single one of those people. You're going to get massive returns on investment from it. That sort of 2% increase in turnout, that was a study that was done on young people. It was a coalition of C3s that work with young people that went around actively getting young people to sign up and give them their cell phone number. So then they could go back and text those people and remind them to vote. And it was a group they were already familiar with to some degree. So, so keep that in mind as well, that that was a 2% increase amongst young people. So we might not see as big of an increase amongst older populations, but regardless, build a membership group should absolutely be looking to build their cell phone contact list. And this is one good reason for that you can remind them to vote, as well as ask them to volunteer, as well as ask them for money.
We do all of those things. One of the things that I'm thinking, it's so fascinating that this is your job, to think about this, to ask these questions, to do this research. And I have a feeling that this field of research is new to some of our participants today. What does it look like? How sort of active is this sort of research, and how does it then filter back to the campaigns that are actually doing the texting? What's the cycle like?
Well, so one thing I'd recommend is if you think the science of this is interesting, there's a great book called Get Out the Vote, and it's by Donald Green and Alan Gerber, two political science professors, and they pioneered this return to experiments. So it was only really in about 2000 that, and they were both professors at Yale, so there's a good New England-ish connection there. They started doing these types of get out the vote experiments. They wanted to actually prove whether canvassing was more effective or not. And so the book is incredibly accessible. It is written to be consumed by political activists and people who are interested in politics. So if you're on a webinar about texting, you should go read this book. I highly recommend that book, and it covers canvassing, phone banking, and it covers some of the more digital tactics. There isn't as much research in digital tactics as one might like, given how popular they are. Part of that is that a lot of the research is just happening within organizations, and it's not shared beyond the organization. So it sort of doesn't become public knowledge. But League of Conservation Voters, their national group does, your national group does a tremendous amount of testing on digital types of outreach and things like that. So there is but that knowledge doesn't necessarily become public. So, I think reading, get out the votes. There's also an organization called the Analyst Institute that perhaps if your organization can kind of connect to, that's another way to learn about some of this research as it comes out. It takes a long time, though, for the new tactics to become studied enough so that we really understand how it works. So prior to our 12 million person texting experiment, there were a few experiments that had 100,000 here, 50,000 there. And so they actually found a similar result. In the aggregate, texting looks like it increases turnout by about 0.25%. We did the same thing to 12 million people, and we found out 0.25%. So we're reasonably confident that the real answer is 0.25%. And when that book is updated in 2 years, then they'll say, okay, now we're pretty sure we have a lot of evidence that the effect is 0.25%. But science is slow, campaigns can be fast, but that's one way that this knowledge kind of accumulates.
Say that, so it's, oh, Thank you. We'll just put the title and the authors in the chat
Yes.
for everybody, because I know we're all going to want to read this. So what are the next research topics for you? What do you really want to know about, say, this election?
Presidential elections are not the best time to get out the vote experiments because, and I think this year the level of interest reminds me of what I experienced on the ground in 2008, where to some degree, if you are like a voter, you're going to vote, right? Just about everybody is going to make it out, I'm going to put it this way, is going to attempt to vote. I don't know what's going to happen when people start actually trying to cast their ballots in some places that are trying to make it harder for people to vote. But I think the sort of baseline level of interest is really high. So that means it's actually really hard to do an experiment and show that you've increased the likelihood of anybody voting because everyone was already going to vote anyway. So personally, I'm not experimenting on anybody this cycle. But another area of research that I do is called relational organizing, and it's helping people get their friends and family out to vote. And so trying to look backwards and figure out who we're reaching through relational organizing. When we ask someone to text their friends, when we ask someone to call their friends, who are we reaching, and is that working? Which I will say is another plug. When you are doing your text outreach, it's not a terrible idea to, if your volunteers reach someone to say, great, can you remind 3 friends, right? So there's this growing effort that when you text someone and you get a hold of them and they say they're committing to vote, ask them to ask 3 friends to vote. And there's evidence from all over the social sciences and all sorts of contexts that social ask is actually more effective than the first text message that you got the person in the first place. So trying to amplify this traditional get out the vote with, great, tell 10 friends, great, post it on Facebook, great, text this to other people. I got a text message recently that was intended to be texted to other people. It was like, hey, we're going to send you a text, forward this. I'm like, oh, that's good, right? That's good outreach because it's more effective coming from a friend. You notice it when it's a friend. So, so trying to understand more about how relational organizing works.
And what's your dream election for building that experiment? If it's not a presidential election, when is the normal election that's good for research projects?
A lot of the sort of foundational get out the vote research is done in things like municipal elections, sometimes primary elections. I still remain interested in email as a potential to get people out to vote, and email doesn't work. And so I have some thoughts on changing the contents of the email message to increase the likelihood that it works. But still, the challenge is you need a good email list, and there's no email vendor. I mean, you can pay someone to get a list of email addresses. It's just not going to be worth any of your money. But so the challenge is email experiments require working with partner organizations that have email lists that can be matched to the voter file. And if you're on a political organization's email list, you're already interested in politics and voting. So where I think that's actually useful is in things like special elections, school board elections, anything that doesn't occur on a November and an even numbered year. That's where some of this digital outreach has the potential to actually reach people and mobilize them who wouldn't otherwise actually vote.
That's really interesting and not what I would have expected. It feels like there's so much attention around the bigger, higher profile elections.
Sure, and from an organizational side, sure, right? You're going to raise money and spend it on the big election. But for the scientists, we tend to do more of the science in lower turnouts, less interesting elections, because then we need, to some degree, it's a statistical problem. You need fewer people in your experiment. You also tend to get bigger effects. And so one thing that we often caution people is, if you got this big of an effect in, say, a special election and this big of an effect in a midterm election, you might get this big of an effect in a presidential election, and that's okay. You're sort of going after an increasingly small pool of people who can actually be mobilized because of your efforts. That's okay. you know, it sort of, we do the science in the other elections and then it gets applied in the big ones.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much. This has been just an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I feel better prepared to, at the very least, answer my friends and family when they say, I am so sick of these text messages. I'll say, no, this is why it's a great thing. And then please sign up to start texting people too. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Dr. Haenschen for joining us. Participants, we will email you a survey later this afternoon, and we do really love to hear your feedback. So please take a few moments to fill that out. I encourage you to join us again next week when Phil Koop, who's one of the co-founders of Revision Energy, is going to join us to talk about the bright future of solar in Maine. It is a great topic, and even better, Revision Energy will be donating 10 meals to local food banks on behalf of every attendee. So if I can bring it all together here, text 3 friends and get them to join next week, because that'll translate into 30 meals for folks who need them. So thank you very much. Thanks again, Katherine, and have a great weekend, everybody.